Good evening. The university lecture is a tradition that dates to 1950. It is a wonderful opportunity for the university community and the public to hear from distinguished faculty members about their remarkable research and scholarship. In selecting the faculty member who will be invited to deliver the university lecture, we happily confront the challenge of choosing from a great pool. The university lecturers are among the most distinguished members of our faculty and are emblematic of the many great researchers and scholars at Boston University. So the university lecture is a 65-year-old tradition. Now, if the university leadership does its job properly, and there is a fiscally stable Boston University 100 years from now, we can imagine and hope that there will be someone like James McCann looking at choices we are now making about water and explaining meticulously researched books and papers where we went wrong and where perhaps we got it right. Who knows, one of our management decisions may be to move the university to higher ground by that time. It is my privilege to invite James McCann, Professor of History, to deliver the lecture. Professor McCann's research and teaching concentrate on the agriculture and ecological history of Africa, Ethiopia, and the Horn of Africa, and the agroecology of tropical disease. He also studies and writes about the history of food and cuisine. He is the author of 5 books. One is called Stirring the Pot, A History of African Cuisine, and another, Maize and Grace, that's maize, M-A-I-Z-E, A History of Africa's Encounter with the New World Crop. Jim evidently likes catchy titles. James earned his BA at Northwestern University and his PhD at Michigan State. He has held Guggenheim and Fulbright fellowships, and his work has been honored with a variety of distinguished awards and prizes, including the George Perkins Marsh Prize for Best Book in Environmental History. He's been a visiting professor at the University of Hamburg and a resident research fellow at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Center. The bad news and good news about introducing the university lecture is that the scholar being introduced always has a record of accomplishments that can't be described with any adequacy within the time allotted. In the meantime, I know you are eager to start on a compelling sojourn into historical ecology with Professor McCann. Professor McCann?
Thank you. It's a genuine pleasure to be here among colleagues, and I mean colleagues I've worked with for many years, extremely productively. One of the things about Boston University that I truly love is the low barriers between interaction between different parts of the university, from the School of Public Health to the cuisine program, to gastronomy, to history, to archaeology, to the natural sciences. It really is a wonderful setting to do one's work. So let me begin by offering you a story. A true story, but a story that has the irony and the wit and the humor of a world which is in change. Mega cities are now growing around the world. Africa is the fastest urbanizing part of the globe. And well, that's not the immediate question here. I want to begin with that. So, beginning from a sense of where we're going, we're talking about Ethiopia, we're talking about the Nile Valley. And if you can see here, what I call the source of the Nile, Lake Tana, where you see a number of places from here. And here is the city of Addis Ababa, one of these fast-growing mega cities in Africa. And the story I want to tell you is a group of people in the 21st century got together, and we're talking about things that perplexed them. And the question that came up was, and let me give you the Amharic version. Probably only one of you in the audience will understand that, but I'll do a quick translation. So, Teshama, Natakuraz, Natamasho, Befit Minnabering. Burhan and Murat Mindebening. What that says is, before we had candles and oil lamps and kerosene lamps, what did we have for light? And the answer is electricity. Because, and I confirm with my friend Asnakau, that indeed this is still the life. Today will we have electricity? Great. Our neighbor has it, bring your laptop over there and charge the battery. This is the world in which power means, water means hydroelectric power, but the point I want to make here is not only to trace the point of hydroelectric power as a fundamental part of development planning, but also water has tremendous meaning. Meaning about something which you take into your body, meaning about a place, meaning about connecting yourself and your culture to a particular activity or place. So, I also want to ask you to indulge me for a moment, because I want to talk about a project that has its foundations here at Boston University called CHANS, Coupled Human and Natural Systems. It's something that's come out of my work with colleagues at the Pardee Center that involves biology, remote sensing, GIS, a range of fields, including me as the historian, to understand a set of things where water is the central point of contact, watersheds. I'm working on the Nile in Ethiopia, East Africa. I have colleagues who are working on Mekong. If you've seen the BU website, there are wonderful descriptions of the work that Professor Kaufman and his group, Irit Altman also, are doing this work in Mekong. Also Belize, also the Gulf of Maine, and what am I leaving out? The Nile. Well, we'll see about Brazil. So these are kind of cooperative efforts, combine disciplines, perspectives, and it's one of the great things about being this university. And so that's part of my great appreciation for being here. So if we look at the Nile is a complex system, by some measures the world's longest river system, comprising of the Nile itself as it emerges from Africa, headed downstream to the Mediterranean, although these days it never really makes it there. It gets to the delta, it's used as irrigation, and it is a, not fictitious, but at least a imagined meeting with the Mediterranean. So here's one ecology where the water doesn't make it there. The Blue Nile, which is what I'm talking about today, and the White Nile coming out of East Africa. This is the extension of over 6,000 miles, longest in the world. One of the things about the Blue Nile is, I would argue that's the point of origin. It's where 80% of the water comes from. It's where 100% of the silt that reaches Egypt comes from. Although the Victorians somehow convinced us that they believe this was the source of the Nile. But all of these units make up a set of sometimes closed systems, sometimes open systems in the interaction of people and of biological systems. It's a fascinating phenomenon to study. So one of the features of the Blue Nile in Ethiopia is the Blue Nile Falls, 40 meters of water that descends from the lake into the deep gorge, deeper than the Grand Canyon. And this is September. So the factor of seasonality depends on what season you're in, where the water is moving, what it's going to be doing, whether it's going to be scratching the surface and delivering the silt off the Ethiopian highlands into the Nile Valley, or whether you're in May. And indeed, this is the same place. So you have a seasonality and you have a change in climate. That's a very important feature of this. And here is the IPCC projections for Africa's potential rainfall. And what you see here, these are two different projections, both of them indicating the same thing. The two sources of the Nile, here and here, will face a period of perhaps reduction of the total water available to 40% less than we have today. Now, if you begin to think about your planning toward harnessing the power of the water, harvesting the water itself for irrigation or for, especially for hydroelectric power, you have a problem coming up in the next few decades. This is the projection from IPCC. We have both the director, the dean of the Pardee School and the director of the Pardee Center. Both have worked on the IPCC, and this is what faces us in the future. So that's the context for what I'm talking about here. So the central point here, where the river emerges, where the Blue Nile emerges, is just here in Lake Tana. Lake Tana is a very large lake system, the largest, after Victoria, the largest in Africa. And its dynamics, its biodynamics are really the critical thing that we want to understand as a program, as future research I've done in the past, and also done with my colleague here on the topic of malaria. But one of the key things to understanding the Chan's goal, this program we have, is that a couple of things. I'll just spend a moment on this. Pre-modern societies were very closely connected to the natural world and the world that sustained them. Yes, there was long-distance trade in high-value, small bulk goods, but the core of what people ate, what they consumed, what they built their material life from, really was local materials. As time has moved on to the era we now live in, and if we can call this the late Anthropocene, is that people live at greater distance from their sources of food, from their sources of energy, their sources of other kinds of life-sustaining requirements. So this is what we want to see in terms of our study, which is not only biological, not only space relationships, but also historical. And I would say fundamentally historical because we're looking at change over time. So this lake is a very shallow lake. It was formed about 5 million years ago by a 50-kilometer lava flow that sealed off the edge of the lake at the bottom here. And as the river began to move into this shallow basin, it created this lake. Approximately 12,000 years ago, there was a dry period. 40% less rainfall, it seems, from the evidence we gather from lake cores and a number of different techniques. So we're talking about a period of time in the past where there was indeed a shortage of moisture, of rainfall, of water. And when that began to refill, it formed again the Nile system. This was true of Lake Victoria and of Lake Tana. So we have a transformation of climate change that we can see in the past that may bear some similarity to what we see now, except we have many more people densely packed, extracting their livelihoods from the place. So as we know, the period was dry, that the lake basically disappeared. After all, it's only about 14 meters deep. It's a very, very shallow lake. This is probably, the papyrus swamp you see here is probably what that landscape looked like. This is the current edge of the lake, but with the papyrus and a variety of vegetation that grow next to the lake, you find that there are a number of features of that, one of which is the availability for habitat for mosquitoes, anopheline mosquitoes. In this case, the anopheline mosquitoes would be Phonestus forenensis that can convey malaria, and in the 19th century, when French travelers arrived at this area, there was no one living there. They called it a fatal zone. There was no city there, there was no economic activity, there was a zone where people stayed away. Malaria being the one chief issue. So this is just a quick run through of the kind of themes that we want to work with in the Chan's program. We want to see the effect of state agencies on livelihoods, on people, how people extract their living from watersheds. Health issues about malaria, schistosomiasis, other kinds of waterborne diseases. How have those changed? How can we expect in terms of challenges in the future? What's happening to nitrogen? And I'll make that point in a little bit, that where nitrogen goes, you have a whole series of effects on water and also on human potential for livelihood. How much of the diet of a local population in Ethiopia or in Mekong, for example, comes from fish? How much from carbohydrates from grain? And this changes over time. New people come in with new traditions, so you have people who are used to growing rice, or used to growing maize, or used to growing other kind of crops, and that affects diet, health, and their income. And so what are the crop changes implied with this transforming water system within a watershed? And what is the relationship to geological factors, erosion, silting? And these are things that we can study in the longer term, but they affect livelihoods today. I'm not sounding here too much like a historian, but this is the Blue Nile Gorge. Deeper into the Grand Canyon, the water is being carried around the loop from Lake Tana around to eventually meet the White Nile at Khartoum, and you get a sense of this landscape. The landscape is made up of layers of sediment, layers of different kinds of rock, and then on top of that, the thin layer of soil. You can see some in the upper right-hand corner there, there's agriculture going on. This is a dynamic system. This is the only bridge crossing the Blue Nile River headed to the north, but you get a sense of a very, quite beautiful, but quite challenging environment which to make one's living. So when you look at a system like this, depends on your point of view. This is a map I got from the World Health Organization archives in Geneva, and what it shows is what the Italians were fixated on. They saw their conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 as being a place making available to them new places to grow wheat, new places to grow crops that they could feed back into the center of their imagined empire. The yellow areas are the malarial zones. So the Italian planners said, okay, number one, we have to cope with malaria. We've done it. We've drained the marshes south of Rome. We've developed the Po Valley. Malaria is not a problem. Well, malaria in Italy had one vector, one type of mosquito only. They got to Ethiopia and they said, my gosh, there are 17, 20, who knows how many malarial Anopheline mosquitoes. So their view was, we can't develop this unless we deal with malaria. And of course they never did because it never really settled longer than about 5 years. So this is the Blue Nile watershed, so we're about to consider some of the key issues involved. You've seen this before. This is the edge of the lake. The edge of the lake is a place where people can gather a livelihood, but surprisingly, there's very little fishing that takes place. This is the egress of the lake, Tana, and also where the water flows out to the waterfall I showed you before. This is now under urbanization. The growth of urbanization begins to transform the edge of the lake, changing the vegetation, changing the amount of livelihood that can be extracted, sometimes in very good ways. If we look at the other edge of the lake here, we see that these upland areas were primarily for developing a local crop F, which is also grown in Texas. Some people know it as it's a forage crop. But what's happening here is that F, which was a very highly prized crop, does not respond to nitrogen. So they didn't need fertilizer. They didn't use fertilizer to get the best crop they could. Being replaced by maize, which is highly, highly sensitive, dependent upon nitrogen fertilizers. So what you find is the lake ecology is changing as the nitrogen flows into the lake, and you begin to see algae blooms, where the flow of that water from the surrounding areas comes to the lake, and it's transforming the lake ecology. This makes 2 points here. One of them is that there's so little fishing activity in the lake that this is the only truck to deliver the fish primarily to the tourist hotels, which are cropping up around there. And I use it, Gene, I'm not sure if you, there's a little bit of a problem with spelling here, but the spirit is there. This is the only such, I can hear the response to that, but we'll get back to this. But it's the only truck. So how are the fish extracted for those people who do value fish as food? And I do, but I'm maybe different. They're carried in tankwa, papyrus boats similar to this one. He's coming into the landing point on the shore, And at that landing point, he discharges his fish into the local sellers, who then distribute it to the tourist hotels or the few places where people actually want to pay extra money to have fish. And here's his catch. I'm sure Les, can you identify those fish for us?
Yeah, they're boring, they're tilapia.
Yeah. So they're Nile tilapia, which is the fish that people eat commercially. But the primary issue about the lake here is that it has 28 varieties of fish that populate the lake, but 21 of those 28 are endemic. They tend to be the barbus type, which biologists love, but no one else much loves them because they're not terribly edible. So he is busy trying to make a commercial livelihood from maybe 15 boats like this land in the morning when you go out to watch them. So fishing is not the primary nourishment of this community around the lake. It is carbohydrate based. They're farmers, they grow grain. So one of the questions is, where do historians fit here? Historians want to understand what are the sources for understanding the past? What is the sequence of the dynamics over time of what people are doing with their labor? How are they supporting their communities? How are they building established communities, kingdoms, and local authorities? And in this case, what I would say is that this is not a great source. This is an Ethiopian document, actually quite similar to the ones we have in the library here. Where did my pointer go? Oh, okay, well, this is the, does it also work as a pointer? Here it is, sorry, this is the one I sought, thank you. This little bit of this church manuscript says, in the liturgical language it says, it's a prayer for if malaria comes. This is a prayer you can say to God. Please help. There's not usually a documented source of understanding about environmental change in this church tradition. So we have to look for travelers who were there in the past who describe for us in detail what they're seeing in terms of the natural world. This is a 1668 publication, which is actually a result of the notes produced by a Jesuit priest, a Spanish Jesuit, but published in 1668. He was there in the 1630s, and they had actually converted Ethiopia briefly to Roman Catholicism. So in this text, we begin to see an external witness saying he's going to the river Nile. He's describing the sources of that. And so we look at this very carefully and say, what do we learn about the meaning of water in this part of the world? And so this is what the text looks like. And here he tells us the pagan inhabitants, they're not Christian up there, they adore the biggest offering. They make a sacrifice of cows at the source of the Nile, where the spring emerges, and begin to perform ritual activities. In this case, they take the head of the cow, as it says here. We'll learn more later about that. But it's for the purpose of making communion with the place. So it's about belief. It's about the sacred waters, or the place where you sacrifice the animal, you consume the beef, and you leave the bones for a bonfire, and those accumulate over time. So this is in the 1640s. And this is the road to the place. What's interesting here environmentally is that this is not a wooded landscape. This is a landscape that's open, as he describes for us in the 17th century. And here is the site of the spring. It's not terribly high, it's not terribly well marked, but it is the point from which the springs flow into what it was to become eventually the Blue Nile, eventually the point where the two Niles come together, and eventually moving on to Egypt. Gishabai is the name of the place. So now let's move to another source 100 years later. This is James Bruce. And his text is describing in great detail, one, it verifies that the Jesuit had been there. They describe the same place. And notice this is this small addition I'm making here, that this was part of John Adams' library that was given to the Boston Public Library, that actually eventually went from the Boston Public Library to this library at a place called Boston University. Surprising. And the other place I found this book published in about 1800 was in Monticello, Jefferson's place in Virginia. So John Adams and we know Adams and Jefferson had a long correspondence. This famous correspondence for discussing the ways of the world, politics, etc. They both had this book. Can we assume they both read the book? There weren't that many books around. I assume that they were both familiar with it enough to want to buy it. So Ethiopia was part of the, so this is looking at James Bruce's, where do I have to point this thing to get it to move? He describes the same ritual. It's a ritual pre-Christian that they talk about the river being the everlasting God, the light of the world, the God of peace and of the universe, and the ritual is, and he gives us a bit more detail. He tells us they kill a heifer. Those of you from rural environments knowing a heifer is not something you kill, unless it's for a very, very important purpose. A heifer is a young cow. You don't want to kill, take off the head, put the head in the water, devour the carcass, because that's your next generation of your cattle herd. But nonetheless, this was done suggesting a ritual sacred meaning to their activity. So we're learning more about, because he's saying again, reinforcing what our Jesuit told us 100 years before, that this is a ritually important place, where the water of the Nile is understood to be the source of the Nile, because after all, this was at the headwaters of the Nile that would eventually reach Egypt, and the Ethiopians, both before and after the arrival of Christianity, knew full well that this was a sacred place. So again, he talks about the establishment of the church there, because when the Christians arrived, the Christians said, we do not want this celebration, we do not want this ritual to be performed here, so please, you people, leave. We've defeated you in battle, leave, we're going to build a church here, which they did. And so what we're having described here is the sacrament of the church layered on top of previous sacraments, signifying the importance of that water. Here is 1974, the church that was built. This took 4 hours by horse to get there. This church is not well maintained, partially because it was a Roman Catholic structure built that was then abandoned, but is still there, at least 20 years ago it was. And so, still signifying the ritual importance of that water that people would drink, or you could, as James Bruce did and I did, stand with 1 foot on one side of the Nile, 1 foot on the other side, as it proceeds down to eventually reaching the Nile in Sudan and then to Egypt. Now, the significance of the Nile continues to this day. This is in the spot of the egress of the Nile, the town called Bahir Dar, and this is a public billboard commemorating the very recent death of Meles Zenawi, the head of state. And so they want to try to make him into a public significant figure for the maintenance of power, the maintenance of administration, the continuation of the continuity of the government. You can see here, the symbol of him is one striding forward, a John Ford movie, and his image there being offered the way the emperors would have been, Emperor Haile Selassie would have been 2 generations before. But the Blue Nile Dam is the symbol of his control of the water, the future of development. And here he's saying development will come from working together, and we will get strong together, and this will continue on. It will be continued. The symbol of the water, the symbol of the dam, and the symbol of the head of state being offered to people to gather around his image. He died a couple weeks before I got there 2 years ago. And this is what is now, you've seen the street. And here's another view of the vision. The vision is these sets of dams being either planned or put in place sometimes by Chinese developers, sometimes by an Italian no-bid company, Salini. And here is the grand one of them all, the Grand Renaissance Dam. Compare the size of what they project to be 6,000 megawatts compared to the size of these other dams. But this is the vision for Ethiopia's joining the modern world, joining middle-income countries, which is their national goal. But around water. They assume this is the plan, 6,000 megawatts. Some people will say, with climate change coming, that's going to be more like 2,000. You're going to have a problem with maintaining that reservoir. You're going to have a problem with controlling the silt. You're going to have a problem with maintaining this system in place. And I think there are genuine concerns about that. But for the symbolic purposes, this is still it. This is Meles. Here's the Nile emerging from its source of the lake. And here is his sense of water is power. Here he's dressed in civilian clothes. He's contemplating things. And what it says here is, it says the vision of Meles. His vision is about development for Ethiopia as a nation, not as just a small place where there's Christians here or other groups here. It is the nation will grow by his vision, Meles Ra'aya. And this is a public display to make sure that people get the messages. This is where the future is going. It's going to be modernization, high modernization, through hydroelectric power. Now, if you go just a short way from this display in the city of Bahir Dar, close to the source of the Nile, there's a church there. A church which is not particularly celebrated, but it happens to be a church with beautiful fresco paintings, painted by someone who later became famous when he went to Addis Ababa. So most of the frames are biblical stories about greed or other kinds of qualities of humans. In this case, we see a very saintly-looking figure. We see him full face. We're seeing that he is picking the fruits. He's picking the bounty of nature. He's looking very pleased, and we're pleased kind of for him. This is one of the paintings inside the church. But if we step back, we want to ask the question, what is the sense of the future? What is the sense that you get of the human-natural relationship, the coupled human and natural world, as seen by the artist in this out-of-the-way church, but symbolic nonetheless. Let's pull back and look at the whole wrong thing. It's upside down, sorry, my mistake. So here's our angelic character. Pull back, and what is the artist telling us? Here's the fuller frame. What you see is a soldier in traditional dress. Looks like he's going to shoot, and it says, I'll show you the full frame, which says Angel of Death. And here is a macabre, is a mausoleum or a grave. We see the serpent, the biblical serpent, coming out of the ground. And I have a tough time seeing it, but if you can see over here, there are two rats. One is Lilith, one is day, one is night. And they've gnawed away at the tree. And this poor innocent fellow, reflecting the innocence of nature, the innocence of human interaction with nature, being attacked by this serpent, by the angel of death, and by other aspects of nature. So this is a depiction, it seems to me, of a very fatalist notion of the relationship between the natural world and human fate. So the title of this you can't quite see it there, but it says Misal Alam, the example of the world, we might say human fate. And this is the conundrum that humans face as they begin to think about what is the world going to be, what's our relationship to nature. And this is a depiction that is in the church, in a place that's not done because it's famous, done because it was the artistic license of the artist commissioned to paint this church. So if we go 2 kilometers away from here, go to where the town is nearby here. It's where I lived for 2 years. One of my friends was a 4th grade teacher. And he was retiring, and things were not so great conditions for being a teacher. So he bought, what any good sensible person would do, he bought a bar. And so as he painted the bar, he said to someone, we don't know who, he said, "Can you please paint me something on this wall? Here's what I want you to paint." And this takes us further to the sense of what is nature, what are the prospects for humankind as we begin to plan and to develop the world we want to live in. So we're very close to here. We could walk in about 10 minutes from here to where Lena's bar is. I'm pushing the wrong button. And here's the bar. This is Lake Tana. This is actually a depiction of the hotel, quite run down now, closed, on the lake shore. And Lena, for whatever reason, a 4th grade teacher said, "This is what I want you to paint." So from this we can read, one, that the international world of the cinema has reached knowledge about the Titanic, written in English. The Ethiopian flag up there. Somehow the Leaning Tower of Pisa is there. But the idyllic setting means, good luck. This is the nature of the lake, and this is the nature of what we might look forward to. And he was a very funny guy. He was a hilarious person by his personality. But this was his kind of message to the world. He's now died. This still is there on the wall of his bar. So that's the end point here about the different ways that water symbolizes hopes for the future, pessimism within a local culture, pessimism within a religious tradition. That the world is not an easy place to make progress in. So you have these different factors that are within the same overall culture of expressing what it is that's coming next. So this is the group at the Pardee Center that's my pleasure to work with. Help from archaeology, from an artist, and from a German biologist who helped with some of this work. So I could leave it with this. This is an extraction of livelihood from a lake. It's a interaction with the water of one type. I find it a beautiful scene, the papyrus boat coming into shore. The alternative is to look at our friend here. So the soul means lots of different things. And so thank you.
I'm sure Jim will entertain questions if you have some. There are 2 microphones.
In the Orthodox Church, they usually come with a biblical reference. Do you know what it is in this case?
So the surrounding panels are biblical references to doubting Thomas. In the case, Thomas has his skin torn off and he's standing there holding his skin. There are other ones, depictions of political figures, but different kinds of aphorisms and parables from the Bible. So I have those photographs, I'm not showing them here, but there's a full range of those direct references to the Bible. This is unusual. The one I showed you was unusual because it has this fatalistic view of this is the way of the world. If you don't get it one way, they're going to get you another. It'll be a soldier or it'll be a rat eating your tree. And be optimistic, but watch out.
Jim, can you hear it? Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and I'm also wondering, Alan and Barbara Isaacman published a book, Dams, Delusions of Development, and it won the Herskovits Prize last year. And one of his points as a historian activist was the extent to which dams destroy populations, destroy environments, and I was startled to see, a whole line of planned dams in Ethiopia. What's your sense of what the very idea of these huge engineered structures, how these structures engage sacred waters, and how do Ethiopian peoples understand that? Is it just about a kind of modernism, or can you talk to us a bit more about that?
Well, in many ways, it's all of the above. Who are you talking to? You're talking to the development specialists who see hydroelectric power as the only way they're going to really be able to electrify the countryside. Alan Isaacman's work on the Zambezi, put that together with the fact that we anticipate there may be 75% less rainfall in that area of Africa. The plans for the dams to create hydroelectric power or to create irrigation are premised upon a relatively static environment. And that seems to be not where we're headed, depending on where you are. But in this case, the planners, developers are optimistic. But within that same context is the fatalism that I showed you here. The secular fatalism of the bar wall with the Titanic image. I'm glad you all seem to have gotten that illusion. The fact that he chose that illusion is interesting about the modernization of the world and the amount of international media that penetrates to even a small town. When I lived there, the water came from the river by donkey. Now there are spigots of water in town. Not in every house, but there's spigots of water, and there is some notion of electricity. So you find that fatalism, but also within the church, the Orthodox Church has a sense of, if it's not one thing, it's another. So you're being tested. Life is a test. Your response to that test tells you whether or not you're saved, whether or not you're genuinely within the realm of God. So all of those things exist simultaneously.
I just wanted to ask about like the future history of the river. So you're saying that there's going to be a lot of drought. Is this like a periodic on and off, or is there going to be like a total drought? And how will that change what the Nile represents and its like sole representation for the region?
Well, so some of the projections about water availability would have to do with, one, it's affected by these engineering projects that divert the water, that store it, by the treaties between the nations, between Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, South Sudan. What do they agree in terms of the amount of water? But what will the water be? When the Ethiopian highlands are one source of water, the runoff there, as opposed to other sources and the controls which are controlled by engineers and political planners. So the rainfall is one factor, but it seems as though it's going to be uneven and what we know, unpredictable. The modeling shows unpredictable amounts of moisture available to people who want to use it, be they be farmers, hydroelectric engineers, trying to provide water to the city, power to the cities. And one last thing there, when you go from the dam, the one dam is being built, you look at where are the high power lines going. They're not going to visit the houses of the farmers, they're going straight to the city. It's unlike the TVA in the US or in Ontario, where the point was to electrify and therefore develop rural areas. Here it's to make sure the city has sufficient power. Factories, people's homes, people who run things need their electric power. That's the design is headed in that direction.
Thank you very much, Jim, for bringing us into Ethiopia. And as you made a reference to the Po River in the context of the Italians. And I, in fact, just read a 17th century document from a missionary who was going through Angola to Matamba. And he, in fact, made, in terms of the Kwanzaa River, this reference of all the breaks and so in the river. And what he said was that in Italy, the Po had bridges and, there were, developed areas. And here he is in, he doesn't know when a wild animal might jump out at him. And, it was a threatening environment. It was natural. Now, today, Africans have to, are somewhat concerned about, the state of their development. Do they keep this natural environment and protect the sacredness of the waters? You know, while other countries, when they were developing, they didn't have to ask permission of the gods or the sacred. So, you know, at what cost should Africa sort of either not take these, you know, advancements, you know, planning in terms of, you know, electric power and developing grids and bringing, and at some point it should go down to everyone. I know right now it's not, because we have leaders in place who are not very responsible. But what I want you to sort of let me kind of have some comfort that development can come, but it has to come, and it has come for other places at a cost.
Well, those are the choices. One of the things I would say is a kind of founding premise of our understanding of these different river watershed systems is that hydroelectric power is not really in the long term sustainable. The recent treaty signed by President Obama and the Chinese authorities was to say, we will develop the Mekong River to control the water, to harvest the water, to maintain it, to maintain clean electricity for China. China needs to stop burning so much carbon. And they're saying we can do that if you help us maintain our control of this water, but tell that to the fisher folk in the Mekong Delta in Cambodia. These are tough choices that are made by international agreements, because water flows across borders, it doesn't care. And then you have the choices made for whose benefit, how long will this last, how do we achieve a sustainable goal of energy, food supply, and a reasonably less conflictual political context. That's a very tough issue. I'm the historian in the group. So we're able to distribute some of these issues about how development takes place, by what might happen, what could happen, and what matters too is this notion of what is sacred. What is something to be protected beyond just the economic value? And that's the interaction that I want to portray here today. And this is the beginning of a project, far from being the end.
30% of the land is occupied by 70% of the population, and vice versa. And what will be the effect of population pressure in the highlands in overall development of the country?
Well, that's to be seen, because Ethiopia is a pretty stable place. They're actually self-funding the Blue Nile Dam. They're not taking loans from anyone else. They're raising money from Ethiopians overseas, from Ethiopians taking a portion of almost a sort of a tithing effect, and they're funding it themselves. It's high modernism at its most hopeful. But what is the long-term effect is the question. Distribution is a tough issue. There, I think the distribution is clearly on the side of making sure the factories have power to maintain themselves, because that's employment. It's production, that's employment. And these are tougher issues that government officials have to face. And they're facing them. There's sincerity there, but yet the longer-term vision, this gets back to the Pardee Center's notion of the longer range future, is what we're trying to add to in terms of to enriching our analysis of all of these different places around the world and finding what is the common ground for planning, for letting policymakers know what to do next.
Well, let's thank Jim again. Now, I have two things for Jim to commemorate this evening. One is a poster of a framed poster from the presentation that was used to publicize the presentation, and another thing that he could use to commemorate. Thank you.